Hi, I'm Gary Stix. I'm an editor at Scientific American magazine, and I'm here with Ricardo Dolmetsch, who is the global head of neuroscience at the Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research. And he's also an adjunct professor with the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford University, and he was previously had a joint appointment with the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And so you've had an interesting career, and what I'm interested in is why, after a successful career in academia that was continuing to progress, that you decided to make the move to industry.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there were at least two things that motivated my change.
Okay.
The first was that I had become very interested in translational research.
Mm-hmm.
I have a son who has autism. I had become very interested in identifying mutations that lead to intellectual disability as well as autism.
Mm-hmm.
And I had become very close to the families. And I was getting a little frustrated that we weren't making much progress.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of trying to come up with treatments. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that I needed to be in a place where I could do that. So that was sort of one reason. The second reason was that I found that we probably didn't have the expertise required to pursue some of the scientific questions that I wanted. And that was mostly because we were not really very well set up to try and do studies in humans the way I wanted to do them. So those are sort of two main motivations for moving.
Okay. The development of new drugs in industry in the neurospace has been very challenged. There's been kind of up and down swings where there's suddenly enthusiasm, but then there are failures, or it takes a really long time, and you get these announcements periodically that drug companies are moving out of neuro. I just heard you talk about this to the group here at this conference, and it seems like you're getting more optimistic now, that there are various areas of drug development, exploration, the preclinical models, and the actual moving to humans that make you more optimistic, and I think that's why you were hired by Novartis. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Of course. So I think one of the reasons why companies have moved out of neuroscience and why there was not a lot of enthusiasm was that despite the fact that there's a huge unmet medical need, people started to feel that we didn't have the right targets, we couldn't perhaps find the right populations, and that the trials were becoming enormously long and enormously expensive. Okay, so in order to move the needle, to change things, we have to come up with better ways of identifying targets. And so there has been a revolution in genetics, which now allows us to identify genetic variants that are associated with specific diseases, even complex diseases. And so this means that we now have targets that are validated in people. There's something broken in some patient that is giving them a disease. And so in principle, at least for a few people, we have something that is a reasonable target. It is not just a target that works in some animal model or that rhymes with an old target that we had. Okay, so that's sort of one good thing. We are developing better preclinical models, and that means that in addition to some of the mouse models, which we tend to not use for efficacy any longer, only for sort of toxicology and distribution, we can also use human models, which is essentially we can make biopsies of people. We can't get a biopsy of somebody's brain, but we can take skin cells, make them into stem cells, and then take those stem cells and make them into neurons or neuron organoids, and then use those as a tool to develop new medicines. And we've been doing that quite extensively, and so we're optimistic about that because we think that it provides a more human drug development system that is not so different from what people have been doing in other areas like in oncology. The third thing that has changed is that we now, I think, have new modalities. And I'm specifically enthusiastic about gene therapy because this has been kind of on the horizon for a long time. But I think now we finally have the right kinds of vectors that allow us to put genes back into the nervous system, infect a sufficient number of neurons in the right part of the spinal cord and the brain. And we now have some fantastic proofs of concept, including the recent successes by Avexis, which is one of the Novartis companies, in gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, which is really revolutionary. This is something that we never expected. But this means that we can now deliver genes, we can deliver antibodies, we can deliver all kinds of things, and it's a one-shot treatment. And that has the potential to be revolutionary, at least in neuroscience. The final, I think, thing that is changing is that our approach to clinical trials is changing. So again, historically, we had these, what I would describe as kind of episodic pencil and paper tests. You'd show up to your neurologist, to your psychiatrist, they would essentially give you a battery of tests. And because these were quite invasive and required a lot of expertise, you didn't do them very often. So even in the best of cases, you might do them, once every 2 weeks or once a month. And you can imagine that all kinds of things could have happened, right? If you had to travel a long way, you didn't sleep well, or you had a cup of coffee, that kind of spoiled the measurement. And so the signal to noise was very poor, which meant that you needed to have enormous populations. So the studies were really big, which made them really expensive. In addition to that, they required lots of really expensive qualified people. And so we've been moving away from that towards less invasive ways of quantifying and measuring human behavior. So phones, for example, that give you sort of short tests for emotion or cognition, ways of measuring how you're getting from point A to point B and seeing how often you get lost, for example, for Alzheimer's. Ways of measuring, for example, eyeball movement and tracking of people's gaze, to measure attention and measure social interactions. And so these things have two advantages. One, they're likely to be less prone to error because they are measuring you every day, and so therefore they can be averaged over time. They are probably less subject to placebo effects because it isn't as if you're saying, well, I think I felt better last week, or some caregiver saying that. So they're somewhat more objective, but also they should be less expensive because we need essentially fewer interactions with caregivers and less travel, and they're less invasive. So those things are, I think, changing the panorama for the future. Now, we've also had a few successes recently that are making us sort of enthusiastic, and one particular success in migraine, which again is a disease area that had not moved in 3 decades. And we now have, for the first time, a prevention. And I think we're enthusiastic about that. And of course, it's not just Novartis. We have other competitors, but I think this can only be good for neuroscience and for the field and for patients. And there are some follow-up therapies, again, for migraine that will, I think, reduce suffering enormously. And so a little success goes a long way. 20 years of abject failure discouraged everybody. So the successes in migraine, the successes in multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis went from being essentially a death sentence to being a chronic disease that is manageable.
There has been a lot of drugs coming on the market for multiple sclerosis, but progressive multiple sclerosis has always been a challenge. But you said in your talk that you've got one drug for this as well.
Yeah, we were really surprised actually, because progressive multiple sclerosis is something that has turned out to be really difficult, and where many drugs have failed. But siponimod, surprisingly, has an effect in at least secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, and so we're cautiously optimistic that this maybe is the beginning of treatments for this aspect of MS, which affects many people. I would say it's not a cure, it is not the be-all and end-all, but it is far better than what we have today.
But it's specifically directed toward progressive multiple sclerosis? No,
not really. So it was actually it was initially developed as a better version of Gilenya or fingolimod, which was what already existed. So fingolimod is used to treat relapsing remitting MS. It is actually quite effective. It is an oral treatment. But it had some side effects in the sense that it caused, at least initially, some cardiac side effects. And so we made a new medicine trying to get past the cardiac side effects, and it turned out that it did not do that. It had exactly the same cardiac side effects as the previous drug, but what it did have was it had sort of different pharmacokinetics, and when we studied it, it turned out to have sort of surprising effects in secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. So, so we don't exactly know why that is, because we never really designed it to do that. We thought that it was going to be sort of an anti-inflammatory and an anti-immune drug. I guess that what it tells us is that there are some aspects of secondary progressive MS that have things in common with primary relapsing remitting MS.
There was one area that you didn't have much time to talk about, which is Dravet's syndrome. We don't have much time left, but just give me a précis on what exactly you're optimistic about there.
Yeah, so we're very optimistic about Dravet syndrome because, again, it is, so let me just go back. So Dravet syndrome is caused by a mutation in NAV1.1, which is a sodium channel that seems to play a particularly important role in inhibitory neurons. And as a consequence, it leads to intractable seizures, and it is a devastating disorder for these families. These children sees many times a day, and we don't have very many good treatments. But the good news is that they have one copy of this ion channel left. And so we've worked very hard on trying to develop drugs that will increase the activity of that ion channel. And for a long time, we thought this wasn't viable because it turns out that there are many different kinds of sodium channels. They're all very similar, and some of them play an important role in the heart, others play important roles in excitatory neurons. So we had to get selectivity, and we had to get something that would activate the ion channel. And I think we're finally sort of in the right chemical space, and we have now things that kind of work in vivo. And so we're cautiously optimistic that we may be able to do something for these families that actually works on the actual molecule that is affected in the disease, the actual gene. There are other sort of symptomatic treatments for Dravet that are now winding their way through the regulatory sort of pipeline, but I would say that none of them actually address the root cause of the disease. We hope that it'll not only address the seizures, but also the autism, cognitive delay that is associated with the disease. And because it is so devastating and one of the most common causes of early onset seizures, we think that there's a huge unmet medical need, and we have the opportunity to maybe do something about it.
What's driven you for a long time has been trying to find kind of general treatments for autism. I mean, Dravet is one example, but it's kind of a special form of it. Do you think you'll be able to get back to that, or is that too big a challenge?
Well, my approach has been, so autism is not a single disease. Autism is a collection of diseases that have common symptoms. I have taken sort of two approaches to it. Approach number one is to take these rare disorders and then see whether we can, once we test them in those specific populations, see whether we can expand it to a broader population. So a significant fraction of kids with autism also have seizures. This might be a general anti-seizure medication that we can use in children. So beyond just Dravet's, there have never been drugs that are developed specifically for seizures in kids. Most of them are developed for seizures in adults, and then they're tested in children. I would say the one exception is the recent trials with cannabidiol. But in general, this could be a new class of anti-epileptics that is compatible with normal development. So that in itself will already be important, because many kids with autism already have seizures, and the seizures could well be a part of their developmental delay. So that's approach number one. Approach number two is to think about it symptomatically, and think about, for example, to improve social interactions. What do we really understand about the roles of serotonin and dopamine and these other neurotransmitters in driving social interactions? Are there any examples of anything that works? And so we're working on that as well. That's a much slower process, basically because our capacity to translate those things preclinically to the patient has not been good. So our social assays in mice turn out not to be very reproducible. So if you want a symptomatic treatment, you're going to have to gamble in humans. And that's a bigger gamble. But we're taking both approaches,
Last question, do you still have the dream of returning to Colombia and setting up a center? I recently visited Colombia to interview Francisco Lopera and the Alzheimer's trial that's happening there. So I'm just curious, there's some really good people in Colombia.
I'd love to do that one day. I'm super excited about how the country has moved over the last couple of decades, and how the health system has become much more developed, as well as the sort of scientific infrastructure. I still think that that it is very difficult to do some of the things that I'd like to do there. And in a way, what I'd like to do is develop enough, enough financial support and infrastructure so that if I were to go back and set something up, I could do it in a way that was self-sustaining.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.